Welcome everybody. My name is Stephen Takasugi and I'm co-organizing this with Ashley. Welcome. I'd like to just thank the IMD administration, Thomas Schäfer and Michael Reban for allowing us and permitting us to have a debate here at Darmstadt, which I think is very important, on issues that are usually discussed behind people's backs. So I really appreciate the fact that our panelists, our 6 panelists here, are sticking their heads out to talk about controversial issues. And so, yeah, I very much appreciate that they're all here. Our curator today is Johannes Polzhofer, and he's asked me to moderate so that he could participate more with his side of the panel. So I'll be moderating this, but usually the curators will moderate their own panels. In any case, I would like to introduce the discussants, the panelists here, and appreciate they're all coming and contributing to this first Darmstadt forum. Here on the con side, which is arguing sympathetically to new conceptualism, is Martin Schüttler, Ashley Fure, Harry Lehmann, and on our pro side we have arguing about new conceptualism and it being a kind of dead end is Johannes Polzhofer, Dániel, Péter, Biró, and Max Miri. Okay, so this is our panel, and we'll begin again with the reading of the prompt by the curator of this panel, Johannes Polzhofer.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. At the very beginning, I want to give thanks to the organizers, Steve and Ashley, and the panelists. Even though I do not belong to the group of conceptual German artists, I appreciate their will to listen to criticism and their open-mindedness to participate in such an important discussion. For a number of years now, contemporary music, especially in Germany, has been faced with a strong collective movement, generally supported and sustained by composers of the middle generation. If you peruse the self-descriptions by the protagonists that delineate the general characteristics of these tendencies, it becomes obvious that this movement is identified by a strong homogeneity in regard to musical content. This is expressed by catchwords such as Music of this worldliness, Musik der Diesseitigkeit, a music of a content-aesthetical turn, Musik einer Gehalt-aesthetischen Wende, or a music of the digital revolution, Musik einer digitalen Revolution. So, what do the conclusions to their arguments look like? Although these artists and theorists remain interested in success as individuals, the role of a composing subjectivity, one that is self-reliant and responsible, is radically relativized. The very historical concept of art without authorship corresponds here to a utopian society that, transformed by the possibilities of digital technology and internet, has changed its thinking in a radical way. These changes in the era of digitalization are understood as arguments for a radically new kind of music. The claim that digital audio programs that could, for instance, replace both the professional training of a composer and the musician, as Lehmann claimed, is used as an argument against a more or less traditional approach to composing. Michael Repan, beneficiary of the new music, claims that one should resign from new music. His article, Hiermit trete ich aus der neuen Musik aus, is famous. Consequently, the democratization of composing will emancipate the artist in his or her infrastructural environment in general, although the conceptualists are part and mostly use a traditional infrastructure and the job markets of festivals and conservatories, although there is no significant audience for conceptual music outside the circle of new music. Moreover, this movement toward conceptualism refutes the need for a musical material progress, Materialfortschritt. The concept, the domination of an extra aesthetical reality, this is the use of new technology replaces the composer's need to develop music on a material level. In the course of this, the use of mass media becomes symptomatic. Music is hence faced with a definition of art characterized by a leveling of aesthetic values. However, music, according to this conceptualism, has not only to depict the social and political realities, but to reflect on the conditions of its own medium. More important than a historically informed and critical work of music, integrating both material and concept, is the creed of composing as relating to the medium itself, a self-reflexive relativizing of this traditional understanding of music. Proponents of this conceptualism emphasize that new music, allegedly the only art form which has of yet had no postmodernity, must reiterate postmodernity in this decade. Despite the fact that postmodernity in its pure form has passed, it is quite obvious that this conceptualism is highly en vogue. But despite the enormous success it has with organizers and curators of new music, for instance Darmstadt 2014, there remains a profusion of important questions in regards to the aesthetic consequences that this movement yields and which have only rarely been discussed so far. Therefore, a bunch of questions arise. Is the specific type of conceptualism we observe since almost 1 decade in Germany convincing in its own premises, and I hope this is the crucial question for us as musicians, in its musical and artistic outcome? Despite the novelty of these ways of thinking about music, you could furthermore ask if this conceptualism is really innovative, as the protagonists claim, and if their own premises are really followed through. For instance, is the emancipation from the concept of authorship and institutions against which they are fighting convincing? Are the products and results of these artists sufficiently critical and precise enough that they can reflect the social realities they are searching for? Are they confronting the problems of the present age seriously and deeply enough? And furthermore, are the dichotomies that are introduced, namely the dualism between content, Gehalt, and material, the dualism between, following Repan, reactionary classical new music and a real new music, this is the conceptualism, sustainable from a composer's standpoint? Do we face simplifications of basic terms here? With the more significant question for a composer today read, how is a serious and innovative composing based on a dialectical unity of content, material, form, and ideas, integral parts of a musical result, made possible? Finally, is the recourse to a simple concept too much reductionism regarding to the complex reality it wants to deal with? Is the conceptual way of depicting and criticizing a complex human and social reality of today sufficient? Does the German conceptualism we experience for a number of years now reach its own political goals? Finally, is this conceptualism critical enough to serve as a critical art?
Yeah, thank you. Now we'll turn to Harry Lehmann, Kant, for 10 minutes.
Okay. So I would like to start with some remarks about the terminology. I will not be using the notion conceptualism. I always speak and write about conceptual music for the following reasons. Conceptual music is not an ism like serialism, minimalism, complexism, spectralism, because conceptual music stands in opposition to all isms. It marks a breaking point in the music history. In addition, conceptual music has the word music in it. Conceptualism does not. The advantage is that it immediately references the field of music and makes a clear distinction from the visual arts. Conceptualism sounds much more like an art movement and could be easily associated with sound art, which conceptual music definitely is not. A second remark about the controversy. I will argue that conceptual music is a way out, of course. A way out, however, implies that there is already a dead end. but in this respect to the new music system. Otherwise, it would be even not thinkable that conceptual music could be a way out. My starting point is that the new music system is in an aporia or dead end because its internal value system doesn't work anymore. New music defines itself by the value of newness, and the value of new was always defined in the 20th century by the invention of new musical material. My diagnosis is that the kind of material progress has come to an end. In the last 20 years, there hasn't been any aesthetical innovation comparable to the impact of musique concrète instrumentale, complexism, or spectralism. Most importantly, even if one can find today a new sound, which is not very likely, the new sound does not carry the power of negation anymore, meaning it doesn't change the notion or the idea of music. The new music system is currently in this dead end because of the end of material progress. And the question up for discussion here is whether conceptual music is a way out of this aporia of the new music scene. There is not only one solution to this problem. First, it is possible to give up the constitutive idea of new music, the standard or requirement for new music to be new. This leads us to postmodernism, a recombination of musical material and how it has been developed in the last 100 years. In contrary to this postmodernist solution, one can try to redefine the idea of newness. In this case, the newness of new music no longer is defined through new material, but through new Gehalt. This second solution, which I suggest, is a Gehalt-aesthetic turn, a paradigm shift from a material aesthetic paradigm toward a Gehalt-aesthetic paradigm in new music. There is no adequate translation of the German word Gehalt into English, so I will use the German notion Gehalt like one uses the German word Gestalt or Angst in English. The meaning of the word Gehalt is close to the meaning of the word content, but there is an important difference. Gehalt is created by an interpretation. In relation to art, the Gehalt of an artwork is the meaning of the artwork, which is created by the interplay of the concept and of the perception of the artwork, and most importantly, the interpretation of this interplay. What is the function of conceptual music in this paradigm shift? What role does conceptual music play in the Gehalt-aesthetic turn? The short answer is, it opens the door. Conceptual music breaks with the value of aesthetic experience in general, like conceptual art. In other words, conceptual music is in its core an aesthetic. It doesn't use or it misuses the aesthetic apparatus with classical acoustic instruments, and it undermines its aesthetic standards. Example for this are 433 from John Cage, Poème symphonique for 100 metronomes from George Ligeti, clapping music from Steve Reich, the speaking piano from Peter Ablinger, or charts music from Johannes. Because of its anesthetic character, conceptual music is the most radical challenge to the material aesthetic paradigm which has exhausted itself today. By rejecting the traditional aesthetic attitude of new music, conceptual music can work as a catalyst for a Gehalt aesthetic turn in new music. But conceptual music only marks the turning point between material aesthetic and Gehalt aesthetic. It doesn't belong either to the one or to the other paradigm. Conceptual music shares with Gehalt aesthetic music the premise that the idea of a piece is primary to its aesthetic realization. On the other side, there is an important difference between conceptual music and Gehalt aesthetic music in their attitude toward aesthetics. Gehalt aesthetic music works again with the aesthetical apparatus of the new music system. It doesn't boycott the aesthetic experience of a piece, but will use the whole repertoire of compositional techniques developed in the course of the 20th century. If conceptual music would be the endpoint of the evolution of new music, it actually could mean a dead end of new music. But this is, of course, a simplification and a misunderstanding. In fact, conceptual music fulfills a historical function in the evolution of the new music system today. It works like a catalyst for a Gehalt-aesthetic turn in new music. In summary, conceptual music opens the door and shows the way out, but Gehalt-aesthetic is a new space of innovation.
So my talk I've called Existence and Distraction. Existenz und Zerstreuung. Today I speak as a composer not about issues that are only relevant to Darmstadt, but rather about tendencies and problems of music composition and the sphere of creative production we experience today. My concerns go beyond the movement sometimes described as New Conceptualism, and I intend to ask more precise, more difficult questions to move the discussion into a productive domain. My first question is, how does contemporary or new music relate to political and technological movements within a society? A current question seems to be how the ritual of music making has changed in terms of recent technological advances. The products of this technology have been celebrated, and the digital revolution has been praised as a means to make music creation and consumption more open, democratic, and groundbreaking in terms of inclusiveness and innovation. But like all technology-driven advancements, there are positive and negative sides to these developments. Like any internet platform, art can either engage with societal questions or problems, or ignore them. It is this mode of engagement in music and how we might address a culture of distraction that I wish to discuss today. As an analogy to questions concerning musical production and reception, I need to discuss some issues in the political realm that concern me and, I believe, should concern us all. I will start out by talking about a country that is not far away and part of the European Union, Hungary. In Hungary, there is currently a new type of digital revolution: total control of all forms of electronic and digital communication by the government. In early June 2014, the government initiated a set of laws which will silence opposition in terms of internet, newspapers, blogs, etc. After signing a contract with the German firm Deutsche Telekom, the government pressured the editor-in-chief of a popular internet site, origo.hu, to resign, or the German firm Deutsche Telekom, via its sister firm, Magyar Telekom, would shut down their portal. As the newspaper Péter Lloyd correctly analyzes, quote, "Die deutschen Unternehmen in Ungarn, ob sie nun im Medienbetrieb aktiv sind oder in anderen Branchen, haben sich im Sinne der Anbiederung und des Augenzudrückens stets besonders ausgezeichnet, solange Steuer- und Arbeitsrecht und andere Investitionsbedingungen in ihrem Sinne gestaltet werden." The German companies in Hungary, whether they are active in the media sector or in other industries, have been good at distinguishing themselves in the sense of pandering to authority and closing their eyes to the situation at hand, as long as tax laws, labor laws, and other investment conditions are created in their favor. End of quote. On June 6, 2014, there was a demonstration against this consolidation of industrial powers, or Gleichschaltung, in which activists, including myself, marched from the parliament to the Deutsche Telekom building. In Budapest, there is another ongoing demonstration that has been happening daily over the last months. In Szabadság tér, or Freedom Square, demonstrators protest against the statue, now erected, built to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the German occupation of Hungary in 1944. The statue portrays an eagle representing fascist Germany, attacking the angel of Gabriel, representing innocent Hungary. This statue is a good example of the present government's attempt to whitewash the history of Hungarian involvement in the Holocaust. The protesters placed stones, candles, family pictures, and historical documentation in front of the monument. We have photos with notes such as, "My grandparents, killed by Hungarian police in 1944. There is a citation from Admiral Horthy, Regent of Hungary from 1920 to 1944, quote, "In terms of the Jewish question, I was an anti-Semite my whole life," end of quote. At the end of each demonstration, the protesters sing the Hungarian national anthem to emphasize that everyone, whether they are Christian, Jewish, homosexual, or Roma, are all citizens of Hungary. Unfortunately, the fact of full belonging to a home country is still not a given for the minority populations of Hungary today, as they continue to be treated like second-rate citizens in everyday life. These two demonstrations show how the present Hungarian dictatorship, financially supported and legitimized by the European Union, existing as I speak here and now, is inherently connected to the Hungarian dictatorship of the past. And just as German industry facilitated the rise of a Hungarian dictatorship 80 years ago, it facilitates the present-day dictatorship and its own kind of digital revolution. This world lives in tandem with what many think of as new media's positive developments. I would point out that it is exactly these developments that allow us to be distracted from the darker side of what is actually happening with our concentration, our memory, our freedom of expression, and our relationship with and responsibility to history. As composers, we make choices. We can choose to actually address what is going on around us in the political and media realms, not by allowing our music to be submerged in these problems, but rather by reacting and responding in an intelligent and hopefully subversive manner. Let us now leave Europe behind and rewind to the 1980s America. Let us look at Andy Warhol's ready-mades. What did this art deal with? For some, it represented a social critique, a mirroring of American consumerist society, which, as we all know, has now become an international consumerist culture. It actually is this so-called critique that has integrated itself into a long, really successful money-making party. This was a time of celebration, a celebration of superficiality, lightness, and the cult of the artist as genius entertainer. We should ask, what did this art help to distract Americans' attention from? In the 1980s, it contributed to keeping Americans from paying attention to the mass incarceration of African Americans, the final solution politics applied to American indigenous populations, enormous military spending during the Reagan years, U.S. military operations in Central and South America, and the takeover of the media and social realms of art by large corporations. American composers created sonorous equivalents to Warhol-esque visual art. The orchestra piece with the pizza delivery man coming in, the postmodern string quartet with accompanying electric guitar progressive rock licks, the performance art piece with looping TV commercials, etc. These compositions seem to take their cue from the television revolution and mall culture, as the composers who grew up with television integrated contemporary media and consumption experiences into their music. Because high art always involves pedigree, such American music attempted to bridge the gap between this media experience, its postmodern ideology, and an imagined tradition of Western art music. Just as Warhol's ready-mades allowed bankers to invest in million-dollar art pieces that collectors could exhibit as socially critical, this commercialized art music projected a socially progressive veneer that could be enjoyed by the subscription audiences who took time out from watching their favorite TV series to go to the nearby concert hall. Let us fast forward to Germany today. We have all heard about the great democratizing potential of the digital revolution. Because of this revolution, composers writing unterhaltende, entertaining music, which is often funny, seemingly socially critical, very masculine, and most importantly, in the largest sense, totally cool. Fashionable, while keeping emotion and depth at bay. This new music is made primarily in and for Germany, a country that is currently raking in enormous profits, especially through the sales of arms, a country with a new sense of itself, self-confident, and ready to give its music festival audiences a new kind of art music which intends to entertain and move us away from the heaviness of German history of the last century. One might ask where the historical aspect of musical material resides as the sampled sound object, be it created by the composer or by anonymous workers in India and China, seems to be the norm in terms of its presentation. Instead of investigating historical complexity, the surface of the material, its superficial nature, becomes the celebrated norm, as lack of engagement allows the music to be conceptual and cool. What is the subject matter for such a music? The media, globalization, the act of composing. It takes on various formats: composed music with video, music as video game, music with text of the composer projected on a screen, composed music for YouTube, rehashed quasi-fluxus actions with musical instruments intended for the German media landscape, choir music with banal techno samples, ensemble performing with comic book pages displayed on screen. Like the art movements of 1980s America, this presents itself as a celebratory critique of commercial culture. The term new conceptualism might be replaced by new superficiality, or even, taking its cue from America, new redundancy. Hearing seems to need help in our era of digital revolutions. It is as though music by itself is not enough anymore. Have composers, we might ask, can we even listen anymore? Have composers become sophomoric media artists who need to have Adorno's aesthetic theory presented to them in the form of a YouTube cartoon? Are we totally distracted in terms of our hearing and comprehension, or can we find our way back to engaging with musical material and content? For me, such an engagement might mean that composers choose, again, to deal with musical material as historical material. We might also have to shut our eyes and concentrate on what we hear and not on what we see. Perhaps to hear what is really going on in our world, we have to experience it in the sonorous realm. In hearing, we might actually concentrate and thereby learn also what to do in terms of making better compositional listening and curatorial choices.
Thank you, Daniel. Martin Schüttler, 10 minutes, please.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm just making a very brief comment. So I'll start by replacing the term of conceptualism with the term of context. I prefer to talk about context, and context in music, showing up the conditions of production and showing up how it's made socially, politically, historically, musically, what it's made of in a broader point of view. This conceptualism, or using a concept in music, is just one possible way to deal with that, in my opinion. So it's a technique, it's a possibility to show where it comes from, or to show how it's made, but it's not a solution for the problem. The problem is that since the first concept pieces or the concept ideas of the 60s in the arts or in music, the idea of concept was brought to the world, it's hard to fall behind in our perception. So we came to a point where everything is contextualized as well. So if you go to a concert, a traditional concert, and you switch into a modus of listening, it's a concept already. It's a historical grown concept coming from the tradition. It's the concept of listening in a space which is provided for listening. I still like that a lot, but for me it's just one more concept, or it shows up as a concert. I'd like to say a quote. I did it yesterday in the smaller group, and I will repeat it because I think it's showing quite good the problem. It's by a German philosopher, Juliane Rebentisch. That's why I'm reading it in German and try to translate it. So the quote is about context sensibility for context, and it's like it's that. Vielmehr diffamiert installative Kunst und Konzeptualismus ganz grundsätzlich, und das heißt auch mit Blick auf das traditionelle Bild im Rahmen oder die Skulptur auf dem Sockel, man könnte auch sagen das klassische Konzert, die Idee kontextunabhängiger Kunst als Ideologie. Means traditional art form, painting and sculpturing as the meaning art has to be like that is already ideology. And later she writes, avancierteste Kunst heute ist immer auch installativ. Umgekehrt ist ein mangelndes Kontextbewusstsein nicht selten ein Zeichen für Provinzialität. So, the very finest, avanciertest art of today is always installative, or you can say aware of the context. And the other way, if there is a lack of conscious of context, it's a sign of provinciality. So, this means you don't have to write only conceptual music, but thinking of the possibility of the conditions of the context is necessary to do art today. So it can be in a broad and a big variety of possibilities, and dealing with the concept is one possible solution for that, but it's at least not the only one. Falling back behind that does not necessarily mean that you can't do this art, but it's just not of interest for our time today. I was talking with Clemens Gardenstätter this morning, and we came to the point that it's almost comparable with democracy. It's something which is as an idea in the world, and there are, of course, you mentioned it, countries in which there's a huge lack of democracy right now, but you can't fall behind the idea of democracy. You can talk about how is it provided, how does it work, how will you deal with it, how is the construction of it, how can we develop it further, but it's not possible to go back. I think this is the same what happened to art in the 60s and 70s. By opening up to the context of art, you have to think as an artist of the conditions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. 10 minutes, please.
Hello. Hello. My comments are also, I believe, relatively brief. I speak today as both a composer and performer, and wish from that perspective to address questions of interpretation and questions as to the role of the interpreter in a new conceptual framework or conceptual framework. And I think that such a discussion has to begin at its outset with a distinction between performer and interpreter, and what exactly is meant by the latter category, which by my ideal standards entail a particular analytical and investigative relationship on behalf of the musician in essentially attaining to the composer's whatever the composer's intentions could be, and that has very much to do with that is, or I should say, it's deeply connected with the questions of musical material, which are to an extent rejected by conceptual music. So there's this, by interpretation, the ideal result or the end goal is for me a sort of an absolution of the performer in the work, and a blurring of the category between work and performer in the performer aspiring to realization. And this idea that the realization of a musical work takes place at the intersection between the work and the act of producing it on behalf of the musician. Now, from my understanding of conceptual music, there is very often the element of critique, or the element of the critical element of conceptual music, is for me often raised to the element of an a priori stance rather than a rather than the result of a compositional process or a compositional investigation, which is worked out within the single work itself. And what I find troubling about that idea from an interpretive perspective is that relegation of critique to a stance as opposed to an intra-musical process also is deeply excluding to the performer and deeply inhibitive in to a degree as to it's inhibitive to the it inhibits the performer from fully absolving themselves in the act of producing and realizing a piece of music. Constantly in an interpretative enterprise of conceptual music, I find myself coming back to the kind of the unnecessary and very burdensome presence of the conceptual underpinning of the work, which continues to kind of hang above the entire process. And that, for me, creates the very. I'll leap from there to what I find to be one of the most brutal paradoxes of the conceptual idiom, which is that a music which aspires undoubtedly to a measure of sociological critique and aspires, I would hope, to raising a critical awareness of our society and dealing with issues of subjecthood and agency, begins very often with the total disenfranchisement of the performer, inasmuch as their ideal role as interpreter is made impossible by the excessive baggage of the concept which lays behind the work. Essentially, it really comes down to a question. The performer very much becomes an executant of a given concept, as opposed to having an open platform to potentially, I would hope, have that moment of a sort of dialectical connection with the piece of music, whereby performer and work are synthesized to some degree to create a musical experience. And that brings me to the question of democratic relations in this front, in that I find, I'll begin now already kind of perhaps preemptively by responding to some of the comments that have previously been made. The question of democratic relations is I think a very relevant one to this, where I think even though there is the best intention to democratically break down what is felt to be this kind of classic archetypical relationship with the composer as top-down dictator, the performer as executant, I think that the flattening of that landscape comes on the one hand of the composer conceding a sort of invested relationship in the musical material at hand, and also comes at the cost of the actual musician's own subjecthood being actualized and utilized in the realization of a musical work. And I don't think that concession is necessary, fundamentally. And I think that it's a premature one and an excessively cynical one. And that leads, I think, starting at this first breakdown of what I would say music communication between composer and performer, where performer is reduced to executant of thesis as opposed to interpreter of musical work. Therein begins the fundamental asociality of the entire practice, wherein, and I think that it really lies there. As I don't think that a listener. I think that what confronts a listener first and foremost in going to a concert, let's presume that, even though Kai has already pointed out that new conceptualism, its audience is very much an inner circle of new music enthusiasts and new music of composers. It's a very small listening public. Let's assume briefly for a moment that a civilian listener were to come into this situation. I really believe that what would confront them, what would be the most pressing facet of this experience, was how totally disenfranchised the actual performing musicians were in service of a concept which in many cases could have been much better and more effectively articulated in all kinds of other means, certainly means which would involve no live performers whatsoever. And I think that there's a great discussion to be had there in the role, the extent to which live performers are necessary within a conceptual idiom. But already starting there, I find the idea of the disenfranchised performer at the very epicenter of the conceptual practice to be a troubling one and an alarming one. And I think that asociality extends then from composer to performer to listener. Those are, I suppose there's a lot that's touched on in there, and I would actually rather give up the rest of the time for discussion and coming back to those points.
Okay, thanks, Max. Ashley, 10 minutes. Ashley also has some examples.
Yes. So my mic is on again. I have taken the position in this debate that new conceptualism offers a way out. To defend this stance, I thus have to first clarify two basic issues. What am I calling new conceptualism, and from where does it offer us a way out? For the purposes of this short statement, I'm going to presume that pieces falling under the rubric new conceptualism act out some combination of the following four priorities. They emphasize idea over realization, a position that brings about a turn of attention away from the aesthetic object and a rejection of beauty, rarity, and skill as measures of artistic value. They are often self-conscious and self-referential, a type of art about art or music about music. They often use minimal or intentionally degraded materials or found materials and lean heavily on text. And four, they often aim to critique the institutions and channels through which they are received and presented. Now onto the where. The where new music desperately needs a way out of is a place of deep intellectual isolation. To be frank, I cannot stomach the way we tend to talk about our work. My brother went to architecture school, and he was constantly forced to consider and express the relevance of his aesthetic choices from a cultural and historical perspective. I was never asked to do this while studying music. As composers, we tend to speak of our music from an interior rather than an exterior perspective. We treat our works as isolated aesthetic objects that construct and respond to their own terms. Because these terms are often context-specific and jargon-heavy, the vast majority of those outside our field have an extremely difficult time engaging with and intellectually connecting to what's at stake for us, what we care about, and why. This has dire consequences. If we cannot express our aesthetic concerns in language that links beyond the esoteric boundaries that enclose us, we will remain an isolated and self-involved subgroup, the support of which becomes increasingly difficult to justify as a public expenditure. I would argue that much of the allure of new conceptualism arises from the ease with which these works reach beyond the boundaries of the concert hall toward other cultural domains like economics, politics, art history, and cultural theory. These are links and pathways that must be forged if we are to reclaim a place of intellectual relevance and cultural connectedness. The question I would like to explore in the next few minutes, however, is this. Is replacing sound with idea the only hope new music has of integrating into an expanded intellectual field? And if this is the case, at what cost comes this cultural connection? Much of the philosophical substructure for new conceptualism is grafted directly from art theoretical writings of the 60s and 70s. Seth Kim Cohen, for example, in his 2009 book, In the Blink of an Ear Towards a Non-Cochlear Sonic Art, sketches out a point-by-point translation of Rosalind Krauss's famous 1979 diagram, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. And I'll show you this is from Seth Kim Cohen's book. On the left-hand side, you see Krauss's diagram, and on the right, his point-by-point translation. Both Krauss and Kim Cohen attempt in these graphs to chart a discursive definition of their mediums. They argue that sculpture and sound art can't be defined anymore as a list of material qualities, right? Sculpture's not just rounded marble. Rather, they must be negotiated through a universe of terms felt to be in opposition within a cultural situation. The oppositional pairs linked by arrows in these two graphs are typical of the type that underscore a lot of cultural theory. Think of classic examples like male versus female, black versus white, gay versus straight, and rich versus poor. Considered in the local context in which Kim Cohen is writing, these oppositional terms pair up like this. And this is another excerpt from his book. We see modernist versus postmodernist, normative versus experimental, quality versus interest, refinement versus redefinition, essence versus effect, and so on and so forth. Throughout In the Blink of an Ear and his more recent book, which came out last year, entitled Against Ambience, Kim Cohen accepts wholeheartedly the discursive assumptions that pit language against the extralinguistic, culture against nature, and text against matter. Derrida writes that nothing exists outside the text, and thus, according to Kim Cohen, meaningful examinations of the sonic arts must be conceived within the realm of representation and signification. I take issue with this stance, and so does the philosopher Chris Cox. In his 2011 article, Beyond Representation and Signification Toward a Sonic Materialism, Cox describes this all-out denial of that which transpires outside language as a capitulation, a giving in. Judging sound solely through its ability to signify not only muffles music's most potent and specific contribution to sentient thought, it also bypasses much of the past 30 years of philosophy. Because here's the thing, a lot has happened in the world since these early conceptualist manifestos felt revolutionary. And much of the most interesting philosophy being written right now, at least to my eyes, attempts to break this bondage to text and rigorously theorize extralinguistic meaning. Take the philosopher Brian Massumi as an example. He's, just as a side note, an interesting guy because he did the English translations both for Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaux, but also for Jacques Attali's Neue, The Political Economy of Music. So many of you have probably read Massumi, whether you knew it or not. In his 2002 book, Parables for the Virtual, Massumi tries to break down the grid-like framework of oppositional terms at the root of so much cultural theory. The book, he writes, is based, quote, on the hope that movement, sensation, and qualities of experience couched in matter in its most literal sense and sensing might be culturally, theoretically thinkable, without falling into either naive realism on the one hand or subjectivism on the other, and without contradicting the very real insights of post-structuralist cultural theory. Theoretically, the point of departure would have to part company with the linguistic model and find a semiotics willing to engage with continuity. The issues Massumi is most concerned with, matter, movement, affect, sensation, intensity, becoming, corporeality, and continuity, are issues many of us in this room battle with daily. And it is high time we speak up and break into that cultural conversation. Cox's qualms with Kim Cohen's conceptualism are, therefore, not that it's wrong, but that it's passé, that it's playing catch-up, that it's going backwards philosophically. His counter to this linguistic model of sonic meaning is not a return to some escapist notion of sound as pure sensation. On the contrary, Cox argues that, quote, sound is not a world apart, a unique domain of non-signification and non-representation. Rather, sound and the sonic arts are firmly rooted in the material world and the powers, forces, intensities, and becomings of which it is composed. If we proceed from sound, we will be less inclined to think in terms of representation and signification, and to draw distinctions between culture and nature, human and non-human, mind and matter, the symbolic and the real, the textual and the physical, the meaningful and the meaningless. Instead, we might ask of an image or a text not what it means or represents, but what it does, how it operates, what changes it effectuates. This is precisely the sort of analysis Deleuze offers in his books on Proust and Kafka, Francis Bacon, and cinema. Of a painting, film, or novel, Deleuze writes, it represents nothing, but it produces. It means nothing, but it works. In the materialist analysis, notes Deleuze, language is no longer defined by what it says, even less by what makes it a signifying thing, but by what causes it to move, to flow, to explode. The jolt new conceptualism has given the intellectual climate of new music is timely and desperately needed. But the specific strategic solution proposed by this approach is by no means the only way out. Nor should it be. The last thing we need is a stylistic stampede toward the land where screeches are bad, and YouTube clips are good, and string quartets are bad, and MIDI realizations are good. That very herd mentality, the complacent huddling around our collective unspoken assumptions, is exactly what got us into this mess in the first place. In order to survive as a creative ecosystem, we need different people doing different things deeply and with conviction. Tension is good. Tension is vital. Tension is how we keep each other on our toes and challenge each other to reach farther. All of us, those who have resigned from new music and those who remain gainfully employed, must develop a robust vocabulary to frame both the way our works are stitched together on their insides and the way their outsides stitch into a broader fabric of thought. Because we don't want only one way out. We want a wild mess of trapdoors and back alleys and wormholes and escape routes that lead to places we never knew we didn't know existed. That's at least what I want. Thank you.
Okay, let's continue. Thanks, Ashley, for those interesting remarks. Let me sketch now some critical concerns about new conceptualism in Germany. Yeah, I don't speak about the global phenomenon because I think we need common ground and common notions. First, new conceptualism and its relationship to material progress. Specified, for instance, in Harry Lehmann's assertion that material progress is an antiquated and obsolete category for contemporary art. In Materialfortschritt ist ein vergangenes Kriterium für die Kunstkritik. I claim that there is a fundamental misunderstanding giving rise to a naive, positivistic art term. Why? Content-aesthetical term, Gehalt-aesthetische Wende, Lehmann, and music of this worldliness, Musik der Diesseitigkeit, Schüttler, prioritizes content and concept. But what happens here? The role pure musical material plays in traditional aesthetical approaches. The role of material, conceptualism criticizes and tries to overcome. This very role is in conceptualism occupied by the extra musical, social, political, technological content. On the one hand, musical material becomes in conceptualism obsolete. On the other hand, you face in conceptualism a new material under a new name, content, Gehalt. And further, what before conceptualism got successful was called substance, concept in music, is now called and reduced to the very notion of concept. Here, Michael Rephan's claim for a music beyond working on sound and musical material emerges. I feel a lot of sympathies regarding the idea to overcome a kind of mainstream reactionary type of new music. Nevertheless, here the arguments fail and the term of material here is only shifted. The problem of material progress conceptualism initially wanted to overcome is not solved but shifted and tragically prolonged and affirmed in a strange kind of dualism, immanentistic, absolute music versus conceptual art. Artistic results become positivistic and the new material starts to sacrifice the pure actuality of the environment, Diesseitigkeit, we live in. But art needs an innovative, historically informed and highly critical relation to its material, even to the contemporary material. Secondly, how does conceptualism relate to the medium it uses? Is the relation to the medium rather ironic and superficial than profound? Are the conceptual strategies sufficient when depicting and criticizing those complex human and social realities of today? Does, for instance, a conceptual piece called Fremdarbeit, often performed since 2009, which used low-budget allied employees, stylistic copyists of music in India and China, who were never informed that they played a role in a in Berlin commissioned piece of globalization critics, who did not even have the chance to attend the premiere, and got only the usual famine wages, Hungerlöhne, not even $100 for their work to produce a score for a celebrated German conceptualist who himself received thousands of euros and is still financially benefiting from the GEMA concerning this often played piece. Is this kind of conceptualism convincing art? How self-critical must conceptualism be to serve as a humanitarian art conceptualism wants to be? I emphasize that we need an extended conception of critique. I emphasize that true art needs a two-stage critique instead of the one-stage critique conceptualism realizes theoretically, wants to realize artistically, and does. I say, the one-sided, one-level critique alone is cynical. Nevertheless, we need this one-stage critical perspective concerning the criticized status quo. This is a this is more than a descriptive but already a selective problematization. This is what a music of a content aesthetical turn does and has to do. So far so good. But one level critique is either the attempt to overcome art into political action in the sense of art as motivation to change social realities, to make the artist to a political activist with the tools of politics. Or it is an artistically underdeveloped approach we face in those conceptual works. Conceptual art, which does not overcome art and turns into this political action changing reality, is affirmative, since it only questions reality and gives a kind of pure antithesis by proving in a kind of pseudo-criticism something wrong. If we now focus on the level of the composer, we see that the criticized problem is affirmed. The piece Fremdarbeit is the repetition of the criticized exploitation. It is the negative affirmation of the facts, since the composer is still the exploiter. And an antithesis is never better than its negated correlate. But what do we need? A critical art is obviously not enough. Even art about art is not enough. We need art which sublates this contradiction above of the one level critique to a higher and also self-reflective level, but without pretending that this solution is a final solution, without pretending that this what sounds in music is its meaning. The method of criticizing, this is composing. The artistic habits, the content, I would say content is rather Inhalt than Gehalt. And the form chosen by the artist, the language and the subject of the responsible composer need auto-reflective objections in the way of thematizing the problem itself. For instance, to be exploited, to thematize exploitation were not enough. In Fremdarbeit, the artist is not only playing the role of the self-affirmative, profiting and benefiting enfant terrible, but it is clear that such art, beyond its critical attitude it has, must be narcissistic and hedonistic, since an artistic concept of critique is not fulfilled. A critical art would also thematize internally and externally exploitation by making the artist, for instance, to both exploiter and exploitee, both in the work internal and in the work external artistic strategies, those of the content, as Lehmann would say. This means composing, this two-stage critique composing, means composing beyond the crude dualism between immanentistic absolute and conceptual music I really do not believe in. Art is critique of the criticized object and at the same time critique of the methods to express this critique. True art is a never-ending critique in the language of art about the language of art. This two-stage critique is skeptical about its thematicized problem, the responsible artist, the whole of the artistic outcome. Art dwells in the space between this aporia, never to reach its own goals and giving full presence to a solution of an unsolvable problem. Finally, Lehmann claims that we need postmodernity in music, since we experience postmodernity in all other arts but never in music. How serious can such a statement be? At first, conceptual art in the 20th century was innovative, postmodernity was creative. But honestly, how interesting can be art reproducing an aesthetic which is already done? And does this kind of conceptualism not rather affirm something that ought to be overcome? I think this absurd theoretical idea witnesses a very problematic relation between conceptualism and art theory. We shouldn't speak about philosophy in this context. Art is something made by the hand of the artist and in the mind of the artist. We all know this. We are artists. Not the theorist who has to accompany art in a very sensitive way. Deleuze did this. But how can theorists of conceptualism in a broader sense know so much about the music they never composed and this music which does not even exist, mostly? I say, the most of this theoretical work is empty and pointless because the object of this knowledge does not exist. Philosophy and theory is abused to anticipate in a quasi-prophetic way what has to be done. There is only one place you can turn facts into normative statements. It's ideology. What theory, philosophy does is never more than to find theoretical justifications to describe the phenomena after the phenomena express their truth, and to question the conditions of the models to describe the phenomena, the art. That's the role of philosophy. But as we know, the truth of the phenomenon is given by the phenomenon itself, not by a theory which has to follow this being, which has to follow up. Although, among others, the thesis of reiteration postmodernity in conceptual music promotes a lot of composers successfully, here the autonomous logic of musical processes is replaced by heteronomous sociological models. My conclusion is, Repin's claim, I resign from new music, must be radicalized. But we need a stronger conceptualism. We need a conceptualism as art, which does not repeat postmodern ressentiments and does not escape into a pure ideological antithesis. We all hate the billion boring flute pieces in new music, but to compose, but to compose something new and creative it was always very difficult to compose something new and creative. And this is a general fact and a general challenge, not an argument against the material progress, but probably for it. But you know better, you're composers. We need an intransigent conceptualism, which is not only demanding in its aspirations, but both fully critical and human in its realizations.
Thank you, the six of you. Now I'm going to open up, have a conversation among the six panelists for around 20 minutes. And then after that, we're going to hand it over to your questions and comments to the panelists as well. So I will now ask any of the panelists if anyone would like to respond to something that's been said on this panel. And then we'll go in order. Just raise your hand. If not, then I'll ask some questions. Yes. Harry, how would you respond then to this notion that material progress, or maybe material discovery, is not yet exhausted? From a composer's point of view.
But I not really heard this claim. I didn't. Maybe I misheard, but I didn't hear that somebody said we have material progress and we only have to go in this direction. Everything is fine. I don't know who said it.
It's in this. It's the Materialfortschritt ist ein vergangenes Kriterium
für
die Kunst in 10
Yes, but Stephen asked me how I respond because somebody of you said this claim is wrong.
I think the final statement about the flute pieces touches on that.
Yeah, but that's exactly my opinion. Stephen asked the opposite. Stephen heard that somebody from you told or says that the whole claim is wrong, that material progress came to an end. Is it right? Did I understand you right?
I'm wondering, since you talk about the exhaustion of material progress in your writing, how do you respond to composers that are still involved with the idea that material and history, say people on this panel themselves, is not an exhaustive, that the depth and the profundity of struggling and working with material is still a valid, important compositional.
Yeah, the second sentence I would, I'm d'accord. It's of course, composition always will have to do more or less to work with material. That's clear. The question is, what is the paradigm? And that is more sociological argument that we have an art system. An art system has its own logic of differentiation, and we can compare it with the visual arts and with literature, and something similar happens in the new music, and then you come to this conclusion that probably this exhaustion of innovation has to do with the end of material progress in new music. That is my claim. But I didn't hear that somebody of the three opponents said this is wrong.
Okay, I'll say it.
That's exactly what I'm waiting for.
So I think there's three parts to this. The first part is what is the context, and I think that this was brought up by Martin also. So cultures create contexts, right? Each culture has a different context. So, and generally, one problem that I have with this whole discussion is, well, which culture are we talking about? So material progress for which culture, right?
Okay.
And it's a real problem because, for instance, I can recommend to you, Kofi Agawu wrote an essay about African piano music, and he talks about the materiality of African piano music, right? And that it's a different, it's also a material development within that system, right?
But
so
we speak about new music in the tradition of Darmstadt. That's quite clear.
Okay, so that for me is a problem. It's a big problem because
but
for
you're
me
part
that's
of it.
Well, I guess I'm here.
You're one of
but no, it's a problem because again, I think that as I tried to point out, perhaps some of us are living in different universes, and also this comes to your question about democracy. So it's a nice idea, this idea of democracy developing, right? But there's also a dialectic of democracy, and that's what I'm trying to talk about.
Yeah,
and that also has to do with the materiality.
I think we agree in that.
Yes.
So what I said is that it's the idea of democracy. So it's hard to fall back behind. So it's not that it's not possible to get rid of the idea. So and it's very right what you say. It's very different in different parts of the world concerning new music and democracy. And maybe there's a connection. I don't want to talk about that, but it's hard to. Talk about something I don't experience. I have to admit I'm a German composer living in Germany, so I just can say something about my surrounding, and I would be a fraud, or it would be very silly to say something about African piano music or writing African piano music or something. I can just write German music. Even if I don't tell it like that, or name it like that, but it's my experience.
Yes.
I think that what can be universally agreed on at this table is maybe not that material progress is dead, but that the notion of progress as a linear movement from darkness into light is dead, and that does not negate material itself as an inevitable substance through which we all navigate. And that is in some ways perhaps a notion that has long roots in Germany and is the death of which is felt perhaps more strongly here, but it has ripples across cultures, I believe.
But it's not so simple. It has implications. Even if you give up this idea of progress, what you really give up is a value, and that new music, like the name says, was concerned with inventing music, expanding the field, and exploring the sound, and that was the main value, and that's why composers became famous and became part of the music history. And if you and this paradigm is exhausted. That is my point. Mm-hmm. And all the progresses came to an end. But the problem we have is much more an understanding about the cultural context, because I think that you say there are problems outside. Yes, I say that is exactly what Gehalt-aesthetic has to deal with, but how to deal with that? If there is a problem with democracy in Hungary, I have no idea how to write an ensemble piece about it with pure music, and that should be communicated, or that should be related to this.
I can give you a few tips.
No. The point. Let me say one point.
Okay, and then Carl.
Yeah. The point is that this idea or this kind of cultural communication worked in the 20th century after the war, and it needs a highly integrated culture with a highly integrated value system, and then it works. The pure instrumental music can communicate like absolute music and some kind of content and an idea. But this cultural context broke down. Usually we call it the postmodernist situation. And you have now to deal with this pluralistic situation where the context is not any more clear. And that's why we have to define the context in which our artwork will be received. And how do you define it? You define it with concepts.
Okay. Right.
It could be a very stupid question, but I wonder if we refuse the idea of progress in art, if there isn't a new realm of progress in the space of theory and define the paradigm of this art, which has to be should be composed and which is defended in such a normative way. It's just a remark. You don't have to answer.
I have just another brief comment that for Harry regarding that. I mean, I find the idea of reducing the history of new music to purely the exploration of sound really an egregious cheapening of an enormous body of work, and particularly, again, to return to my contribution as addressing the role of the interpreters, and that each, at least in an ideal standpoint, each composer's contribution to that body of work proposes a totally different task for the interpreter, which, I mean, and there is content there, there is substance there that cannot, I think cannot be glossed over in such a massive way.
Yes.
Actually, I want to link in that, because Max, that's what you said before. I have to deny it for myself very strongly, because I'm very much interested in working together with interpreters. All my pieces are closely connected to the sound production and the persons. So that's something I found out during your whole of your speeches, that everything was mixed up. So all the positions was in just one sack, and it was like everything came into conceptualism. That's why I'm talking about contexts. So it's very something different if you write a conceptual piece, which is maybe one formation or one technique you use, or if you deal in a broader way with material, with musicians, with sounds, and it's not gone. It's just a different approach. And I would say during the last 50 years, maybe it's not about black and white. It's always things coming up and getting more important, and other getting less important, maybe because we have a bit overheard them or a bit too strongly emphasized in the last 30 years, and now it's going to the other side and overemphasizing something. It's necessary to show where problems are. I think that's a bit what you said.
Yeah. I wanted to jump in too for you, Max, a comment on your thoughts. I think you're right to point out that there is a difference in this relationship, and I would imagine as a composer navigating some of these new conceptualist pieces, or however we are naming them, which is why I think historically we saw a couple of things happen. One is that there were very close alliances, or performers specializing in a type of conceptual music, and we also see a lot of composers performing their own conceptual music, or there are much more blurring between that authorship and performance. And I just want to point out that blurring seems to be happening, and it's also getting called narcissism and kind of, gosh, what were some of the other great epithets thrown out? Hedonistic and self-serving. And so I think it's important to maybe give it another name, which is that's a practical acknowledgement that the demand for a performer in a performance piece like that maybe are either unfair or are better served by placing them on the author, her or himself.
It's a general question about the content aesthetical turn. I wonder where are the critical tools to control the contents of this art, and does it correspond, or has it to be identified with the collective mainstream consciousness of the society we live in? What is the And according to this, is there an internal way of art to be independent of these contingent social facts it relies on? How critical can those tools be?
So, important question. First, I speak always about Gehalt-aesthetic, not content-aesthetic, because it's really an intellectual phenomenon. You have to combine perception and concepts and have an interpretation, and that's not what usually is understood as content. So I speak about Gehalt. And the question is, in which way can be Gehalt-aesthetic music or art be critical? It's definitely not critical in the sense of political art. If you have an opinion and you represent it again in a piece, then it's kind of ideology and critical and political art. But this is not interesting, and that it's not at least what I understand with good art.
So you would say that most of those pieces which were composed are uninteresting?
Usually, I think it's not very. Or let's see, really good art is seldom. That's what I can say. It's not easy to make a good artwork or a good piece. That is an exception. How can today an artwork or a music piece be critical? In order to answer this question, you need a model of society, because critique relates to something, and it probably relates to society. And in my opinion, art and philosophy, they have this common function to provoke new self-descriptions. And important is the notion of provocation. Though that means the artwork is like a catalyst or a prism that you can watch or experience your own worldview in a different way, or to rewrite your own worldview. What usually is not, what you would not get if you are confronted with mass media and with common meaning. So critical art is in a way subverting the common meaning, the common understanding. Why is it necessary in a democratic society? Because this society is evolving, and an evolving society has to restabilize itself permanently. And this restabilization happens through a self-description which enables political decisions. So if your self-description of the society is totally inflexible, your society will not work anymore. And that's why I see a productive function in general of art and a critical
Very
function.
briefly, what you sketch is a pure functional notion of art. So
You ask about the function.
I conclude that in this sociological functional way to understand art could be replaced by some other medias, like in Brave New World you would have some drugs. You could take very good journalism. So why can you not replace art? And I think you are pure functional. So.
But you asked me about the function. Your question was.
I do not ask about.
If you ask about what is art critical, so critique is by itself a function, right?
I asked about the autonomy of the function, and I asked in a broader context, not to explain me how functional can art work. I asked about the condition to describe art only as functional. It's a meta-critical question.
Can I jump in for one other question as well? This is, I guess, a question for Dániel and for Kai, and maybe also speaking to you, Max, from a composer's perspective. Kai, you talked about a double-level critique, and Dániel, you talked about a music which is politically rooted and engaged and encourages attention and sort of depth of thought, if I can summarize. And I'm wondering, or presuming that both of you write that type of music and sort of seek that in your own artwork. And nothing I have heard today or have heard so far voiced by too many people who would identify as writing conceptual music is sort of disbarring you from pursuing those paths and from pursuing those avenues of composition. So my question to you is, I hear sometimes in the resistance to this type of new work an almost existential threat from people not acting in this way, and I'm wondering, where does that threat come from? If you think it's crap, like, write better music. If you think it's not critical, write more critical music. If you think it's not political, write better political music. Like,
right. Sorry, very briefly, I think we discussed this here. We don't speak about music in the very sense you should, because you can only consider music through the tools and the language of music. So you have to think within the autonomy of the work, even the autonomy of the conceptual music. What we do here is a kind of meta discussion of something what's going on aesthetically, theoretically. That's why I think we should stay there. And yeah, I just want to say there is a dead end, which is in political ways dangerous, in ways of the sincerity of humanities. I said we should separate ideology from philosophy, so we shouldn't take everything as granted what we get. Maybe so that's why I didn't speak about music.
One interesting point. We disagree. I would say all of us say that music is much more than just what happens inside music. And so we talk about music on a meta level and within the music itself. So it's combined. It's not possible to say it's just music and we have to talk inside the music and separate that from what is music in society, what is music in the context, what is music in history, and so on. And this is material as well. For me, this is composable material.
Yeah. But I think, again, so what I said at the beginning was talking about tendencies, right? So actually, I'm not talking about, just talking about general tendencies and places where I see a type of, just as you said that there's a type of reaction, so maybe 30 years there's a reaction in one way. So my goal here is to just kind of give a warning, in a certain sense, to those reactions, because part of, perhaps for my universe, for my, and I say this not only musically, I say this culturally, the problem of memory is critical. So what do we remember? What do we carry forward? Also the ecology of our sounds, of our languages.
But isn't it a much broader
problem? But it's related to composition, because in composing we create Esperantos, right? Each one of us creates our own Esperanto. And that Esperanto has to have some sort of difference. And the word Gleichschaltung, right? Which I used in the Hungarian context. It's very important.
I think you shouldn't use it in the German context.
Okay, well, sorry, I'm just a guest here. This is really it's important because.
But maybe it's a different discussion, because I have the feeling it's more about the style of arguing. Of course, there are people who are very convinced about their art, and I think every artist has the right to be convinced of his art, and to not to say you all have to compose or to make art the same way I do, but to say I'm convinced of that, and that's what I'm standing for. And to see in that kind of that automatically kind of ideology, or to say everybody has to do that way, this is maybe the misunderstanding. It's just I have the feeling that it's something which has been underrepresented, at least in Germany or in Europe, for the last 30 years, and I'm coming up and in the last 10 years fighting for a different approach towards music, which is not so much appreciated, and so that's something else than to say to describe this as a kind of ideology.
Thank you. I have to open this up to the audience now.
Of course.
Okay, so please.